Catherine, so I'm about to live now.
Okay,
And
we're ready to begin. All right, I think we're ready to begin. Is that right?
yes, we are ready to begin now.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's nice to be able to do this with the technology, but of course, after a couple of years of this, we're all used to the occasional glitch. So no worries there. I want to welcome everyone to the panel on gender and political participation in the Middle East. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Catherine Warwick, and I'm an associate professor at Villanova and director of our Center for Arab and Islamic Studies. But more importantly, in the context of this conference, I'm the editor of the Digest of Middle East Studies. And all of our participants today have recently been authors in our journal in a special issue that we did in October of 2022, focusing on scholarship on gender and politics in the region. So I'm really delighted that our participants are here today to talk about, in most cases, the research that they've recently published in the journal, and also Lindsay, I think, is presenting something new today. So I will introduce them very briefly, turn this over to the speakers, who are all going to have 10 or so minutes to present, and we'll leave some time, as usual, for questions and discussion. So just briefly, joining us are Gail Bottorff, who is the Associate Director of the Center for Public Policy at the University of Houston, Nawra Al-Lawati, who is in the Politics Department at Liverpool, but I think, Nawra, you're in Oman at the moment, is that right?
Yeah, I'm a PhD student at the University of Liverpool. I'm also a lecturer at Sultan Qaboos University in Oman.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And Lindsay Binstead is a professor at Portland State University. Our fourth presenter is Pinar Dokamachi, and I don't think she's going to be able to join us today. We have run afoul of the American time change to daylight saving time, but Pinar will join us toward the end of our session if she's able to do so. So these are our three presenters, and I will turn that over to them. I think if we go in the order listed, Gail would start first, but we can do this however you like.
Sure, if my co-panelists don't mind, I'll go first. It's probably a good one to go first to set the stage. I'm going to, I know sometimes Zoom does not like to go forward in PDF, so if my slides aren't changing, please let me know. So thank you all for attending, and thank you to Catherine and the Policy Studies Organization for extending this invitation to us. And this is joint work with my co-author, Bojana Welburn at Smith College. And this piece that we published in the Digest is really just a survey piece about where the literature stands on quotas in the Arab world, more or less, 20 years on since the first elections in this century, with the quotas beginning with Morocco. So here is a map of the Arab League member states showing both whether or not they've adopted a quota and which type of quota. We see we've just grouped by the broad categories of quotas, whether they have a legislative quota, whether they don't have any formal quota, and whether or not the country has reserved seats. And we can see the
Gail, I'm sorry, but
in a chat there, yeah, the slides aren't changing. Okay, I knew it was happening. Okay, let me just go out. I think of the full screen mode, and you should be able to see it's less pretty, but you should be able to see now can you see the map? Okay, good. I'll just it's a little smaller without full screen, but hopefully you can see it. So here's again the map of the Arab League member states showing both whether or not they have a quota, as well as the percentage of women in parliament. We can see we have quite a bit of variation, going from lows of less than 1% to about 5% in the lower quartile, to the upper quartile of 26% to 50%. And we can also see that there are some countries that still do not have any formal gender quota adopted, but also that there is, we've seen now, the adoption of both legislative quotas and reserved seats. So since 2014, of the 22 Arab League member states have adopted formal gender quotas. Right? Today, or when we wrote our article in the fall, about 16.5% of seats in the lower chambers of Arab League member states are currently held by women, and this is compared to 26% globally, right? As you might expect, among these Arab member league states, the percent of women in parliament is higher for those that have a quota and than those that do not have a quota. And we do see that the quota type tends to make a difference. Those countries that have reserved seats have, on average, a higher percentage of women than in states that have the legislative quota, and those that have the legislative quota have higher percentage, again, on average, than those that do not have a quota. And as we discuss, and others before us have discussed as well, that how well quotas do in increasing the number of women in parliament, the descriptive representation depends on, one, the quota type, as I just mentioned, but then also how it's implemented. And Tunisia and Algeria are two really good cases on this latter point about the importance of implementation, and whether or not states are, or sort of political actors are, punished for not abiding by the quota, or how much sort of leeway and interpretation there is in terms of holding, for example, in Tunisia and Algeria, the political parties to have a certain set of a certain proportion of women candidates matters a lot for increasing the percentage of women who eventually get elected. Now, of course, when we talk about the impact of quotas, we want to think about a number of different dimensions, both social and political. And for the political, of course, a lot of work outside the Arab world attempts to look at the impact of more women on sort of legislative outcomes and on policy outcomes. In terms of political representation, we have some work by one of our co-panelists, Lindsay, and I'm sure she can tell you lots more about this than I can, and Miriam Aissa, who studies Algeria, showed that having more women in parliament, even if we're not necessarily seeing big changes in policy outcomes, there is this sense that having more women means more women are represented. And this is particular, one of the mechanisms here is feeling more comfortable going to the member of parliament to ask for constituency services. Okay, other work have shown that committees and the legislative process is of course important. So even if women are getting access to lower chambers of parliament, they're not necessarily, there is an additional hurdle to get access to the institutions within, or the committees within the parliament that have real decision-making power. And so we've seen some work, notably Shalaby and Elliman, about more women are slowly over time translating into more influential committee assignments. Right? And when it comes to the social impact of attitudes, of quotas, which we here are looking at really attitudes towards women in politics, at least in this article, we've seen some improvements over time, but again, we caution against reading too much into this because, you're talking over a 20-year time span. Lots of things are changing, not only just whether or not there's a quota. So it's very hard to methodologically attribute causation to the relationship between having quotas and attitudes towards women in politics. Okay, but this is still important, generally, whether or not we're attributing it to the impact of quotas or to the increasing presence of women in political life across the Arab world. We do see improvements, and not all cases, as we note in our paper. Some countries have definitely seen more uneven changes across the 2 decades. But on average, overall, for the countries included in this is from the Arab Barometer, about 33% disagreed or strongly disagreed with the statement that men make better political leaders than women. Okay, and this was across all waves. But of course, we see big gender differences, and those gender differences, how big those gender differences are, did vary across countries. As you can see, larger. I just put two examples here because the figures we have in the paper are too small for a presentation. So we have here Jordan, where we've seen somewhat steady increase, but still not quite a majority of either men or women strongly disagreeing or strongly disagreeing with the statement that men make better political leaders than women. Whereas in Morocco, we've seen much bigger increases over the period that the Arab Barometer has been surveying and asking that question. Okay. One of the other things we talk about in terms of the social impact in the paper was about some of the kind of the backlash that isn't necessarily captured through this question. You saw this in Jordan for many years, disgruntled men, but also women, about the way that the quota had been implemented in early on in the initial phases, which worked as like the proportion of whoever got the highest proportion in their district, as opposed to a nationwide as a nationwide quota list. And also in Algeria, which ended up repealing their quota, which had set aside about 1/3 of the parliament shortly after the Arab Spring. They repealed in 2021, and part of that was, as Miriam Aissa has talked about, and another author, partly due from international, but also because of domestic pressure. Okay, and I know we only have 10 minutes. I'm trying to keep it short. I kept my slides under 10, and so the last thing I want to show is that, generally we have very strong support for gender quotas in the Middle East and North Africa, in these Arab League states. So of the 12 countries that were asked about, 12 Arab countries that were asked about gender quotas in the fifth wave of the Arab Barometer, we see strong support for using quotas as a tool to increase the presence of women in parliament. The majority of women in all countries, the vast majority of women in all these 12 countries agree or strongly agree that quotas are the right tool to increase, or are a good tool to increase the presence of women in political institutions, right? And even for all but 2 countries, we see a majority of men also agreeing with this statement that that quotas are an important tool to increase the presence of women. And the 2 exceptions are in Algeria and Kuwait. And also we saw that, of course, we see again, as we did with as attitudes about attitudes towards women as political leaders, whether or not women can be president or prime minister of a Muslim country. We see again big gender gaps, okay? But the gender gaps we see in this particular question are biggest in Algeria and Kuwait, where we had 25-26% percentage gaps between men and women in terms of the proportion agreeing or strongly agreeing. Okay, and so just to wrap up, we have a really rich literature that we surveyed for this piece, highlighting the impact of not just quotas, but just gender and politics in the Middle East, and how women are navigating the political space. I think within the context of the Middle East, we have a good understanding of why regimes have adopted these quotas, okay? But lists information on why and when they might repeal, and Algeria is a good recent case of this. And although we have less work on policy outcomes within the Middle East and North Africa, I guess relative to other regions, it is difficult to assess, right? We're talking about authoritarian regimes and legislatures with wide variation in the powers they have to actually make policy, and in sort of regulations for the implementation of those policies. But then also, as the case that's well known in the Middle East and North Africa, we have constantly changing electoral rules. That is a favorite tool for the regimes to use, and we've seen them. We've also seen some of that carry over into the quota laws themselves, like the case of Jordan, which I know very well, right, has changed how their quotas are sort of the laws for that quota have changed over the past 15 years, which again makes it difficult to assess. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions, of course, and I'll turn it over back to Catherine.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting. And I have a couple of questions that I will hold on to till the end. Noura, I wonder if you would like to go next.
Yeah, sure. Let's do that. It's been a while since I last used Zoom for a presentation. I can't find the share screen button.
It should be at the bottom of your window.
No, I don't have that. I'm still not getting it. Anyway, my slides are not as pretty as Gail's slides, so I'll just, they're mostly like notes, so I'll just speak without the slides if that's okay. So I was very happy to have my paper published with Catherine at the Digest of Middle East. It was really a pleasure working with such a great team and having my work published. My work is on the substantive representation of women in Oman, along with understanding informal quotas and appointed parliaments. So it was a case study that looked at how women represent women and act for women. So substantive representation of women is a form of representation that focuses on what women do for women, or what do critical actors do for women. And it involves looking at acts for women. Where do they do it? What are the sites? What do they do and how? So my paper stems from a large work that I've been working on, which is my PhD work, which looks at Oman as the whole case study and substantive representation across different sites, including the upper parliament, the lower parliament, activist groups, and women associations. But this paper focused on appointed parliaments, which is the State Council, also known as Majlis al-Dawla in Oman, which was established in 1997. In Majlis al-Dawla, all the MPs are appointed directly by the monarch, the Sultan. And then we have the lower house, which is a Shura Council, where women or MPs are elected. And we have rather much more representation in the State Council, women representation, which accounts for around 17% of the council. And it's usually assumed that the Sultan will always appoint around 17% women into the parliament. So that's what I call the informal quota. So it's not a legislation quota, but it's an informal quota and has been implemented since the establishment of the council. And then my paper looked at data driven from interviews with 10 female appointed MPs across different rounds of the State Council rounds to see what women are doing for women, the substantive representation, and its interaction with the presence of more women through the informal quota, and how women are acting for women in a setting of an appointed parliament. I think a lot of the literature focuses on elected parliaments, and less attention is paid on what happens in upper parliaments. So my results showed that by informal quotas, we had an increased pool of critical actors, which are people who act for women, and hence there were more debates, gender debates that on women's issues, more lobbying for women's issues, and some changes were also noted during the period where we had women appointed, and those women gave examples on what they did, and it was through three main mechanisms. Female State Council MPs reviewed all the legislation that was passed to the council for review, while considering what are women's stakes in every article that was passed for them for review. So usually the council would get a set of legislation passed from the Council of Ministers or proposed laws, or from the elected council, and they would have to revise these laws. So the women who I interviewed asserted that when they reviewed laws, they always kept an eye on what were women's stakes in these articles, and then debated any discriminatory clauses. And by that, they would convince the males in the parliament using human rights, using CEDAW. And in some cases, they were able to get the vote to change the legislation. And there was a case there which women were not able to change the vote. But the MP said that she assumes that the monarch was actually listening to the recording of the parliamentary session, and on how the discriminatory clauses are against CEDAW, against women's rights, probably had influenced the decision of the monarch, which when the legislation was finally passed, because in Oman, legislation is not only passed by parliamentarians, but the decision involves parliamentarians, ministers, and the higher level of the Sultan. So the laws came to be in favor of women. And then also my data showed that female MPs proposed studies, proposals for studying certain matters related to women within the parliament, including having legislating gender quotas in the council, unemployment issues among female graduates. And these issues were usually passed directly from constituents to the MPs, or sometimes they were just the MPs looking at what were the concerning issues within the society and passing them to the parliament. Which shows that even though those parliaments were appointed, they were not directly accountable to the people in terms of elections. They still were very much close to the society and were passing issues related to women. And three, the female MPs were also very much well connected, mainly because appointment by the Sultan is considered as a prestigious kind of bestowment on someone. So you get access to greater networks, to more influential people. So those MPs gave examples of speaking directly to ministers about certain decisions that they wanted to be taken, or legislation to be revised that is related to women. And in some case, one of the MPs also was able to request a change in the marriage law, where women were not in the past allowed to get married without the approval of their guardians, the male guardian, the father. And this MP sent a letter to the monarch explaining that women were not being married for reasons that were irrational. And then a legislation was passed that allowed the judges to marry women to whoever they wish without the approval of their fathers in certain cases. And if this was rejected, the legislation said that the Sultan that they could appeal directly to the Sultan himself, which shows that a lot of substantive representation was happening among appointed female MPs within the State Council. But this did not come without challenges. Obviously, even though there was some representation, higher representation than the elected council. Still, the women were not the majority, and sometimes they could not have the full vote. And also, there were some institutional problems, such as decision-making was dispersed across committees, and each committee looked at, for example, social issues, economic issues, legal issues, environmental issues, and the MPs felt that they were concerned about issues of their committees more than women issues in general. So they would say, that's not my specialty, that's a specialty of another committee. And from that, I would think that if there was a specialized women committee, things would be more centralized in discussion of women's issues, especially that women's representation in each committee is low. And also the legal committee has more decision-making power, and there was limited representation of women in the legal committee. And also there is an issue, female MPs, even though they were acting for women, they were a bit hesitant to be identified as feminists or to be purely acting for women, mainly because of the domination of patriarchal norms within the country on women's issues. The opportunities that I saw that appointment to the State Council gave women more prestige, more access to networking opportunities with ministers, with royal family and decision makers. And appointment was through the informal quotas, took away the pressure of re-election. So these women did not have to abide by the patriarchal norms going on or expectations going on by the voters, especially that considering that the country has a lot of strong patriarchal norms. And also informal quotas allowed for gendering of debates, messages being passed to the monarch directly, and the appointed parliamentarians, female, were also supporting the elected MPs in the Shura Council. Finally, just thinking about way forward for policymakers and NGOs, I would say that my research, the findings of my research, that like appointment parliaments can also deserve some attention to be seen as sites for substantive representation of women. Informal quotas can increase the pool of critical actors. I'm not saying that they're better than legislative quota. Legislative quotas are better, but this is just another form of quotas that has not been studied or looked at thoroughly. And for policymakers, especially in Oman, I would think, even though the literature is mixed on importance of women committees, in the case of Oman, I see that a women committee within the parliament would help focus attention to women's issues discussion. And also female MPs need more participation in legal committees, and probably appointment of women from legal background so that they would wish to choose to go to legal committees, because these women were actually choosing which committees to be to. They were not assigned to these committees, and yet they were not going to legal committees. And then also in terms of NGOs, I think even though like the NGOs within Oman, there's like very limited role, but I think like NGOs within the region, if they would pass invites to parliamentarians to attend training sessions to understand more about what other countries are doing for women, what other MPs across are doing for women, and share tactics, share strategies, I think that will be very, very helpful, learning from other experiences, and then further training on how to be close to women constituents, and also how to take on their issues within the parliament and outside Parliament. And that wraps up my presentation, and I would be happy to answer any of your questions later on during the session. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that. It's a really interesting look at access to power. Lindsay, can we turn it over to you?
Yes. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here on this panel, these interesting issues. I'll be talking about a book that is under contract. I'm still working on some of the chapters, but I'd like to share the argument with you and get some feedback. It's called Why Women Vote, WASTA and Political Participation Under Authoritarianism. As Gail mentioned, the percentage of women elected to national assemblies across the Arab region has risen dramatically in the last 2 decades as a result of electoral gender quotas. In 2000, fewer than 5% of women in Arab lower houses or unicameral houses were, or fewer than 5% of seats were women, and yet the percentage of seats held by women has increased to nearly 20% in 2020. At the same time, even though much of the work that we have focuses on elite women and elite women's electability, we don't know very much about whether and why ordinary women participate politically, including whether they vote. And in this book, I discuss 2 myths. The first myth is that women in the Arab world cannot vote or do not vote. I found a blog online that makes the argument that patriarchal societies are a huge barrier to women's voting. Because of Sharia law, women cannot vote in Libya, Jordan, Kuwait, and Lebanon. So we have this, conventional wisdom that maybe women are less voting than men, but there haven't been any rigorous studies that explore this. And in fact, when we look at the Arab Barometer, the gender gaps in voting are there in each of the waves, but they're really not as large as we might imagine them to be. This figure shows the average percentage of men and women who voted in the previous parliamentary election in each one of the waves of the Arab Barometer. So this is pooling, for each wave, this is pooling a number of different countries. And we can see that in the first wave, which was back in 2006 to 2008, the gender gap in voting is only 3%, and it never increases in any wave above 8%. So we can see that women are voting in the Arab world, maybe more than conventional women or conventional wisdom might suggest. However, the second myth is that gender gaps are equally large. We can see that this isn't the case. When we disaggregate the Arab Barometer by country, we can see that there are very large gender gaps, but also some negative or reverse gender gaps in which women are voting more often than men. So for instance, in Egypt on the left, there's an 18 percentage point gender gap in participation in elections. However, in Morocco and Jordan, there's a statistically significant reverse gender gap, meaning that women are slightly more likely than men to vote. So this is a puzzle that we want to explain. And most conventional wisdoms, as we know on the region, attribute gender gaps to religion and political economy. So I'm going to address those conventional wisdoms in this book. So the research question is the following: why, after decades of universal suffrage in most Arab countries, are women less politically engaged? And why does the gender gap in voting all but disappear or reverse in some conservative states such as Jordan and Morocco? Indeed, some evidence has looked in the past at gender gaps. In a web posting that I wrote with Ellen Lust, we looked at Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, and we asked in the Transitional Governance Project to what extent men and women voted in the previous the first election after the Arab Spring. And in fact, looking at these 3 cases, Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, we found a 19 percentage point gap in Egypt, a 10% gap in Tunisia, and a 25% gap in Libya. And we hypothesized in that posting that, in fact, what might drive gender gaps in voting, while not being religion, because all of the countries under study are Muslim majority nations, we thought that maybe personal status codes could explain some of these differences. But the extent to which that is the case, it's questionable whether that's the case, because we can see that when we look at all of the countries in the Eurobarometer, there's much more variation. For instance, there's a reverse gender gap in Jordan, which has a conservative family code. And yet there is a gender gap in Tunisia, which has the most liberalized, secularly progressive personal status code in the region. The dominant conventional wisdom in the literature on the United States is that women overcame the gender gap in voting by leaving the private sphere, that is the home, and acquiring participatory factors such as labor force participation and activism through the public sphere. However, this argument about women's mobility and the impact that personal status laws have on voting doesn't seem to fit this initial pattern that we're seeing in the Eurobarometer. In this book, I argue that the drivers of women's political participation stem not from religion and the rights that women have in the personal status code, or political economic factors, but the clientelistic institutional context. Drawing on original data and the Eurobarometer, I argue and empirically show that women who enjoy connections are more likely to vote. That is WASTA. In the book, I conceptualize WASTA as linking social capital. We know that women are systematically excluded from clientelistic networks, not only in the Arab region, but in other regions as well. For instance, in my previous work, I showed that in Morocco and Algeria, when I asked parliamentarians what proportion of requests they received from constituents, on average, members received between 20 and 30% of their requests from women. When women were elected, they received about 50-50 requests from men and women. But we know that women are marginalized from linking social capital with parliamentarians. And so I hypothesize and show that it's this marginalization from linking social capital with parliamentarians that is driving gender gaps where they're present in voting. Okay, so WASTA is a type of clientelism. It's a type of linking social capital. This is a social, economic, and political practice through which loyalty to family, tribe, religion, and sect is used to achieve mutually beneficial exchanges of interest. The term linking social capital was first used by scholars at the World Bank, and it is a third kind of social capital. Putnam talked about bonding social capital, bridging social capital. Well, linking social capital is the norms of respect and networks of trusting relationships between people who are interacting across explicit, formal, or institutionalized power or authority gradients in society. So linking social capital is a good concept to use here because it is conceptualizing the idea that the citizen is asking an elected official or appointed official for help with a problem. And to the extent that there are norms of trust and reciprocity, the citizen is more able to receive a request from the elected official if he or she has linking social capital. Okay, so I used 10 original surveys that I conducted in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Jordan between 2006 and 2022. And I used 18 countries that are in the Eurobarometer. In chapter 3, I look at the pathways that men and women have in terms of acquiring linking social capital. And I show that men and women use different pathways. So while it was true that men have an advantage in accessing linking social capital, or WASTA, within the political sphere, women are able to access linking social capital in the private sphere at levels that are at parity with men. So for instance, when we ask individuals who they would deal with if they had a problem with the government, it's true that men are much more likely to approach the local government, a tribal leader, an MP, but women are much more likely to use the private sphere, a family or friend. Okay, so I show that that women are only marginalized from linking social capital in the public sphere with elected officials, but in the private sphere, when it comes to their families and their tribes, they're able to access linking social capital at levels that are at parity with men. So this suggests that in those contexts in which tribes are politically salient, like Jordan, like Morocco, like other monarchies, this increase in women's ability to access linking social capital through their tribe or through their family may be driving why women are voting at high levels in Morocco and Jordan, but not in some other more secularly progressive states like Tunisia, where tribes are not as prominent. Okay, so and so we have evidence of this. For example, when women are asked why they contacted a particular member of parliament for help, you can see that in every country in the study, in the constituent surveys, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, women are more likely than men to say that they contacted the member of parliament because they were a member of their tribe. So for instance, in Morocco, 30% of men said that they contacted the parliamentarian because they were a member of their tribe, whereas 60% of women said they contacted that parliamentarian because they were a member of their tribe. And this was the case in every country, regardless of whether tribes are salient. So women are using the private sphere to develop linking social capital, and this is going to be what is driving voting. Okay. And then in the next chapter, I use voting as the dependent variable, and I show that this is the case. The predicted probability of being very likely to vote is strongly related to whether linking social capital was established. So here we can see in Morocco that it doesn't matter whether you're a man or whether you're a woman, the likelihood of having voted increases significantly if you've contacted a local counselor. So for men, if they have not contacted a local counselor, they have a 45% likelihood of having voted. But if they have contacted a local counselor for help, they have a 57% likelihood of having voted. And it's the same for females. And these patterns fit every country in the data set. So in conclusion, gender gaps in voting stem not from religion or political economy, but the clientelistic contexts. Previous studies in Western countries argue that women overcame the gender gap in voting by leaving the private sphere, that is the home, and acquiring participatory factors in the labor force. Yet I show that in the MENA region, there are unique pathways for women to empowerment, often through the private sphere. When women are able to access linking social capital through tribe and family, they are much more likely to vote. Thus, in monarchies, which tend to have more politically salient tribes, women are more likely to acquire linking social capital and vote. In addition, electing women, especially through quotas, also improves women's engagement by reshaping networks and creating new sources of linking capital for female citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was wonderful and really, really interesting. I see that we have Pinar with us. That's wonderful. I'm so pleased you were able to join. Let me just turn it over to you if you can have some time for comments.
Well, I'm so sorry for joining in late, the daylight savings in different countries that I figured out last night. Very happy to kind of catch up a little bit. I'll just talk briefly about my paper and see if this works, if it's okay with everybody. So in the paper is kind of takes a look at participation in the civil society by kind of looking at the Turkish case and looking at the dynamics between secular feminists and pious feminists in Turkey. My paper looks at women who identify as both secular and pious women as well as feminists. And asks two main questions. How can secular and pious women's rights groups in Turkey work together in a joint civil society project as equal partners and by mutual consent is the first one. And the second question is, how can secular feminists and pious feminists in Turkey transcend their political fixities and transform their relationship in a more plural and collaborative manner? So in the paper, I focus on these questions, which I broadly refer to as the question of collaboration. I take a look at a very specific time frame between 2011 and 2013, which was the beginning period of my broader research. But during this period, I could obtain more open-ended, more engaged narratives about a possible collaboration between the two groups, which I didn't see in my later research. So this kind of gave me the impetus for asking the question, okay, like let's look at that period in which the political structures were more favorable in terms of these two particular women's rights groups to work together in a civil society project together as equal partners willingly. So the paper kind of takes a look at the lessons we can draw from this period, which I hope one day becomes more relevant in terms of elucidating the way forward when these the current polarizations in terms of the secular and pious political imaginaries start to shift. And I think, like with the coming up elections in Turkey, Turkish politics, which might produce different patterns, we can perhaps get one step closer to that. So my findings suggest that rather than just the secular pious divide in the country, which goes back to 2 centuries ago during the Ottoman period, there is also another wave of disagreement in the civil society that is determined by feminists' own interactions. So instead of being just a discursive political divide, there's also a more relational division that is more dynamic and open to change. So I argue that reducing the disagreement between these two groups into the political divide is a limited perspective because it limits our imaginative capacity for future encounters as well. So I suggest that we should reframe the disagreement as a relational flaw that might help both groups to transcend their fixities and also represent the current dynamics in a much more accurate sense. But yet, as I said, my more current findings suggest that the political environment that inflicts fear, hatred, and polarization is very much connected with this failure of seeing the more dynamic side of the divide, and is very, very also forceful as well. But yeah, like with the shrinking of the civil society also that limits women's interaction in terms of their own feminist relationships also contributes to this divide. So I think it's much more relevant to kind of take a look at this previous period in which there were more openings for change, and therefore see what we can learn from this period. If you're looking for hope and a way to transform politics more than what we have at hand. So based on secular feminist and pious feminist perceptions of their feminist relationship in the women's rights movement during this period, I argue that the two groups coordinate the two main waves of relationship, one marked by their political fixities and ongoing polarizations, and the other one iterative civil society encounters, which I refer to as feminist iterations in the paper. For this reason, although the relationship might appear like a battlefield between two different forces, by looking at it as a relational flow that doesn't deny this battlefield, but also say that it is interactive with more relational dynamics, we see the sporadic strategic collaborations that occur between the two groups, which doesn't necessarily maintain a long-term partnership, might iteratively lead towards that direction. Although in those instances there might be a lot of conflict and collaborating or like working together with the as an idea might look very uncomfortable. It is through these feminist iterations and through this discomfort that the discursive polarizations might be challenged and moved to a different level. However, because of the complexity of the disagreement, I suggest that we have to see feminist iterations not just in a way of democratic iterations, which is a concept by Sheila Benhabib, which works on deliberative democracy principles, such as like transparency and equality and freedom towards information. The process may not be deliberative. There might be more complex communication techniques that needs to be adapted and be used. Because like if we take a look at deliberative democracy kind of principles, not only they are very hard to be maintained in a context where the civil society itself is shrinking, like the Turkish case, but also the discomfort and the kind of the pain that is associated with working together is actually can create better results in the long run. And in the paper, I give a few examples about how this has happened during the CEDAW negotiations, like the civil society project that brought together different groups during the CEDAW shadow report writing phase. That has created this instances, but it has dissolved at the end with a horrible kind of a fight between the two groups, actually cause more mutual understanding between the two groups at the very end. So the paper kind of takes a look at this complex dialogue perspective that Maria Luganes kind of coins and says that it might be a better way to understand the relationship between the two groups. So I think I'll leave at that in case like just to kind of have time for any other discussions. And once again, sorry for joining very late.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you were able to join us at all. And thank you for finding the time to make the presentation. We have a little bit of time left, and I know that there are going to be questions from the floor. So can we just open up for that?
Yes. So do we have any question? Yes.
Thank all of you for your presentation. Very informative. My question is about to what degree each of you thinks that, and obviously it's different from country to country, but and we have limited time, so I'm asking for a broader general idea of to what degree these governments are allowing these quotas and other rules to ensure participation of women. To what degree is it something of a release valve for steam intended to give the appearance of genuine reform versus actual genuine reform?
Who wants to be the first to tackle that one? Just jump in.
Lindsay, I wasn't sure if you were going to answer, but you look like you might. So if you want to answer, please go ahead.
Sure. Well, we know that autocratic regimes and men use women's rights to signal not only their commitment to women's rights, but also commitment to reform. So we did see an acceleration of gender quota adoption even after the Arab Spring. And I would argue that in Algeria, for instance, one of the key reasons when it was implemented in 2017 was as one of the suite of reforms that was used to signal, reform after the Arab Spring. So one way this has been referred to is gender washing, the idea that quotas they have very few costs to autocrats in terms of the change of the structure of decision-making and power, but on the other hand, have these potential benefits of signaling commitment to women's rights and maybe even making concessions to domestic women's coalitions. But the international signaling is the most important factor that has been identified in the literature on the Middle East and beyond.
Yeah, so we have another question.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I'm hesitating because of the feedback. Okay. Has any research been done on how women govern if they govern differently than men do?
Sorry, we have a coordination problem here. Yeah, I think there has been some work. I mean, Lindsay, you're probably best suited panelist to answer this question about how especially they deal with constituency services. Other work by Marwa Chalabi has looked at the legislative committee roles and how they, and in general, how women tend to be perceived to be working differently, but then also how they in fact are working differently. Lindsay, you wrote several pieces on this, so you're better suited to speak to this.
I would add that it's important, and I'm sure everyone in this audience knows this, it's important to point out that authoritarian legislatures are weak and co-opted. So the power of legislators to shape policies and legislation is limited. And so while there is only limited evidence, and actually Nara, you actually, from your case in Oman, you cited in your presentation one of the few examples that I've heard of a direct relationship between electing women and a policy-making change, even though, as you pointed out, personal status codes in authoritarian regimes are often reformed as a result of the autocrat or the monarch, making that a palace policy. That was certainly the case in Morocco, and it seems like Nawra, you said that was the case in Oman. But do women govern differently? I would point out that when we look at the backgrounds of female and male legislators in the region, one thing that we notice is that when women are elected, they often have less political experience than men, but they're highly educated. They're usually much more educated than the men, their colleagues. And so this might be one reason why we're observing a change in attitudes towards women leaders in the region, because the starting point of view is that women don't make good political leaders. And then you see women being elected to office and they're qualified, they're hardworking. This is something that I think constituents and citizens notice. And so I would argue that this is one reason why we do see this change taking place. But one of the main ways that we see women govern differently is through this clientelistic linkage. It's through this idea that if people have more, if our networks are populated more by others of our same gender, if you elect women, then what we actually notice is that women don't only serve female constituents, but they tend to serve men and women at parity, whereas the males tend to be connected with constituents that are more often men. And so in a transitional setting or an authoritarian setting, this is very important to think about the ways in which women are increasingly able to gain representation, even if it's clientelistic representation, it's informal representation through their networks with these newly elected female members.
Thank you so much. So is there any more question or no? Yeah, I guess that is it from the room. Yeah. So Ms. Kathy, if you want to take over.
Well, we have just a couple of minutes left, and I actually did have in Lindsay, in your case, in the book, I find your argument about clientelism really persuasive, and particularly from the perspective of just sort of anecdotal information about the Jordanian case. I remember being told many times, the legislature is weak, so they're not going to be out there crafting policy. What we need them for as voters, we need them for access to services. And in a clientelistic structure, if women can't deliver that, what's the point of, returning lots of women to office? If the legislatures remain weak, that's a factor in itself in how people evaluate candidates and how they evaluate what it means to be, serving in political office. So I think you've linked these things in a really interesting way, and I can't wait to see the book. I found your argument today really, really engaging and persuasive. I don't know if the other panelists have questions for one another or anyone wants to add anything. Now is your chance.
No, just picking up where Catherine, you mentioned, I've heard, obviously for, over a decade of doing work in Jordan, the sort of the initial backlash of the sort of the first and second iterations of the quota program, but then also in speaking with women parliaments, especially earlier on, like in the mid, like 2015, 2017, of like, okay, we're getting elected, but we still don't have resources to engage in constituency services to the extent that men can. And it could have been something like, okay, we don't have qualified staff to have an office, right? And that matters for sort of how the constituencies how effective they can be in helping with their constituencies in, in WASTA or whatever it may be, is that, especially earlier on, they just didn't have the same training or support staff to engage in constituency services to the same extent as men. I think that's been changing since you've had some women, of course there's high turnover in Jordanian parliament and anyways, but you've had some sort of slow buildup of that expertise, which I would assume is starting to pay off. The other interesting finding that came out late last fall, Lindsay, this may have been one of your surveys, about that now youth under 39 are more likely now to want to vote for a woman a female candidate than for a man, which is a particularly striking finding. So I think many of us, probably not to speak for everyone, but are cautiously optimistic about women being able to continue to advance in the political space and in the Arab world.
Thank you so much. So we have one more question from the room. So, yes.
Hey there, me again. Since you're talking about Jordan a lot, I actually worked at an NGO that was looking at female unemployment in the kingdom. And it was striking to me how, compared to even most other Arab countries, there was a huge level of female unemployment, specifically in Jordan, but that Jordan also had one of the highest educated female populations within the Middle East. And I'm wondering if that combination of a bunch of women looking for work and being educated makes it easier for them to vote, since say they don't have a job and they're looking for something to do, obviously, but that, you know, they're more civically minded because of their education level, and that maybe if there are other women or men who are working, a lot of them will say, oh, it's not, you know, worth it. I'm too busy with my work, or too busy with other stuff. And that because you have this high unemployment level, that maybe makes it a weird combination that explains the higher voting rates, if I'm not mistaken, for women in Jordan versus men. If I think that's what someone presented.
Lindsay, is that a question for you or for Gail?
I mean, it's definitely, I mean, you see that trend. I mean, if we were, you know, within the context of US politics, you know, education, of course, is a big predictor of turning out to vote. And if we were to extend that, yeah, we'd expect to see more women than men voting in most other countries in the world, since women have over the past couple of decades been outpacing men at a global level in terms of higher education. So it's definitely an interesting argument that or an interesting link that you're suggesting. I don't have any information beyond that you generally see high levels of unemployment amongst those that have a college degree for both young men and women, but women in particular, because, you know, in Jordan and you know, they have less opportunities for employment there. But.
Yes, I believe that I have one more last question, which is the problem in the part of the world, is it close and twinning between the culture and religion? And that's the main reason for the weakness of the legislator. Beside absence of the real political, will give women the opportunity of equality. So I'm not sure this is the answer or the question. But yes, so anybody's want to take over and answer something or want to add anything on that?
Well, just in terms of the political will, I know at least I was talking generally, you know, some sort of at a regional level, but I think you see quite a bit of variation in political will. I think sometimes there's more political will for greater reforms to improve, you know, economic participation of women and political participation of women in some countries, but they at the top levels, but they have to sort of delicately balance the desires and the preferences of some of their ruling coalitions, which may be less progressive. So I think there's quite a bit of variation there. So it's hard to talk at the regional level about the lack of political will, because I don't think it's necessarily lacking in all countries.
Well, I guess that is it. So then in this case, then I would love to thanks to everyone, like, you know, whoever like participated in this Middle East dialogues. So thank you very much. And then we will be ending this section. Yes.
Thank you to all of our participants. It's really interesting research you've presented. And it teaches us, I mean, we talk about gender a lot, but this is also very much about parties and electoral behavior and authoritarian politics in general. And so a lot of lessons to draw from the research you've presented. All very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it.
All right. Good day, everyone.
Thank you.